Dr. Sunita Iyer, and our next section is on trauma-informed care and teaching. So before we get into how we can become more compassionate educators and start to apply our understanding of neurobiology, stressors to childhood behavior, let's understand a little bit about what trauma is. So trauma in and of itself is not something that we can pinpoint or identify. One person's experience of a situation may be traumatic, whereas another person's experience of that exact same situation may not be. So ultimately, trauma has a lot to do with perception. So if you remember when we looked at the diagram of the brain, there was this part of the brain that called the hindbrain, which I mentioned we weren't going to spend a lot of time talking about. This is not the only part of the brain that perceives trauma. There are many parts of our physiology that do, but this is one part that does figure into how we perceive whether or not an experience that we're having is traumatic or not. Another thing that we'll talk about as part of our understanding of trauma is the concept of resilience. And what does it mean to be resilient in the face of trauma? So again, what is trauma? Really, it's an individual's emotional response to a stressful event. And it firmly rests on what our perception is. And one's perception is going to be, on some level, dictated by all of their experiences they've had before the stressful event. So let's think about how that might play out in adults. In adults, we've had a lot more life in our life, a lot more years under our belt. So we've had the potential to experience a lot more stress, potential to experience a lot more trauma. Conceivably, we've made it thus far. We've survived that stress and trauma. And so on some level, we've also developed a lot more resilience. When we think about how trauma and stress affects kids, keep in mind that they have far fewer years under their belt, especially when we're looking at the K-3 population. And which also means that they have a lot less knowledge of how that stressful event is going to affect them, whether it's going to hurt them, they don't have the concept necessarily, whether it's going to make them stronger. And they don't necessarily have the same ability to be as resilient as we do, simply because they haven't spent as many years experiencing those stressful events and also surviving them. On the flip side, kiddos have the ability to be more resilient in some ways, simply because they don't have as many memories to refer back to. For instance, I experienced the stressful event of someone yelling at me, and I've had this stressful event happen 17 times before, and this is how it always ended. So there are ways in which kiddos are potentially less resilient than adults because they don't necessarily have the history, and there are ways in which kiddos can be potentially more resilient than us because they are not necessarily comparing their experiences to a long history. So their level of fear and the level of helplessness they may experience in response to that stressful event can sometimes be incredibly high, much higher than you or I as adult people might think it would be, or it could be much lower because they don't necessarily know yet that this is a situation that might harm them or might actually impact them for the rest of their life. So their ability to cope is going to be dialed in according to their level of fear, helplessness, and lack of control that they're experiencing in response to that stressful situation. Trauma and its effects are dose-dependent and timing-dependent. What does that mean? Essentially that one of the things that contributes to our experience of stress as traumatic and our ability to be resilient is how much of it we actually receive. So that's the dose dependency. And dosing can be frequent. So think about how you might take a medication or a vitamin. It can be frequent and daily, but in low doses. Or it could be a 1 or 2 time event, but very, very, very high dose. Both have the potential to cause harm to our bodies if it's something that is, ultimately harmful to us, stressful to us. So taking something in that is potentially poisonous or toxic to us, albeit in little doses, but every single day, can be just as harmful to our bodies, to our physiology, to our minds, and our well-being, as something that we take in a very, very high dose, but simply once. Both can potentially be lethal. That's a concept of toxic stress, if you've ever heard of that phrase. A lot of this also has to do with timing. So when I talked about kids and adults and their different levels of resilience, this is what we mean by timing dependent. There are certain stages in childhood development, specifically when we're looking at the ages in this K-3 population, where when stressful events happen in this population, it is possible that those stressful events become more deeply lodged for them, that they have the potential to become more traumatic for them than, say, that same experience happening to us at, say, 25 versus 5 years old. And that's the difference in terms of whether or not a stressful event becomes traumatic very often is when it happens in our lives. Does it happen at 5? Does it happen at 25? And it may not necessarily have anything to do with whether or not that event is, quote unquote, really stressful, if as an adult person. So the kiddos that we're working with and the behaviors we're seeing are not only a factor of their ACEs or their adverse childhood events, but also how often they're experiencing them and when they're experiencing them in terms of their lifespan. And there are all kinds of sources of trauma. So obviously ACEs and everything that we discussed before is part of it. But there is so much more that can actually create trauma for kiddos and for us than neglect, abuse, poverty, grief. So loss, either loss of a family unit, loss of a parent. For many kiddos, the loss of a family pet, the process of bereavement, especially if it's their very first experience with grief and loss. What we call social dimensions of health. So the things in our world and our society and our culture that actually help keep us healthy, where we live, whether we have clean air or water, whether we have healthcare services, whether or not we experience racial inequities or disparities in our world, and microaggressions or macroaggressions every single day. Obviously, poverty, racism, bullying. So whether we're talking about in-person or virtual online bullying, and specifically with this year on the heels of a pandemic and many students learning remotely, there has been a significant increase in virtual or online bullying that kids are still experiencing, but we're not necessarily seeing. Repeated punishments, discipline, and being singled out in school. So here's a really important place for us to consider as educators and adults in these kiddos' lives when we're looking at their behaviors. Our response is not only important in terms of being investigators or detectives, but also to not re-traumatize these students. And that very often, if we think, again, to what we've already learned, is that if our students are having a great difficulty in managing their behavior or being in compliance in a classroom, it is entirely likely that they have other stressors in their lives. Are we one of them? Are we the people who are actually contributing to that? So considering our classroom environments and our own punitive or investigative ways of responding to students has a lot of potential impact in terms of whether or not those stressors become traumatic for kiddos. Exclusion or isolation. There are obviously some situations in classrooms where you really do have to remove a student who is causing harm to themselves or causing harm to other students in the classroom. It's simply the next best strategy for the purpose of safety. But there are many moments where we exclude or isolate students who are exhibiting behaviors that we consider undesirable, and that exclusion or isolation can actually become an additional stressor and or traumatic for that student over time. Again, thinking about dose dependency, how often does it happen? A student being excluded or isolated once may not be the thing that turns that stressor into trauma, but being excluded or isolated every single day throughout the course of their elementary education absolutely could be. And one thing for us to consider, and we will get into this further along the line when we discuss these topics and systemic factors, is to think about school policies that actually criminalize student behaviors and could actually be a systemic process that contributes to whether or not those stressors become traumatic for students. And why does it matter whether or not a stressor becomes traumatic? Well, part of it is to understand the behavior that we're seeing right there in that moment. Part of it is to become investigators and detectives ourselves so that we can potentially apply a different mindset and a different response to that student's behavior. But the other piece of this is to think about our role as educators. We want our students to learn. We are trying to affect their brain in positive ways, and trauma can actually impair the way the brain works. So if we are either part of that process or exacerbating that process as educators and adults, it affects students' ability to actually process verbal or nonverbal written information, meaning most of the information we're presenting in the classroom. It affects their ability to use language and relate to others, meaning it could actually impact their social relationships and the ability for that kiddo to be included and not isolated and to be able to make friends, which is one of the key elements of elementary education. It can absolutely affect their ability to organize, their thinking, the concepts of cause and effect. So when we're talking about management models of thinking and coming up with a plan, if they can't understand that their behaviors are having a certain effect on the classroom or themselves, they don't necessarily have the ability in that moment, if they are stressed, having a normal stress response, and potentially traumatized, to understand what are the other effects we can create with our behavior if we can't even understand the cause. It's also difficult in those situations for them to carry out a plan. So even if you do catch them in a moment where you can make a plan, it might be very difficult for them to carry out that plan and to actually be able to reflect on that process about whether or not it was successful. So many of our disciplinary processes that we come up with, even through our own understanding of social emotional learning, become incomplete in the face of trauma. And we don't necessarily know where these kiddos are unless we're becoming the investigators or the detectives. Are they simply stressed? Are they simply having a neurobiologic response to one stress? Or are they actually traumatized by ongoing or timing-dependent stress? And if they have moved into the realm of being traumatized, then many of our other models of thinking and managing behavior on some level become obsolete, because the person that we are working with and the brain that we are working with is not necessarily in a place to adapt to those models, which means that as their educators and their adults, we have to adapt to them. This slide talks a little bit more about childhood trauma and its long-term impacts, how much more often these kiddos are likely to develop depression, anxiety disorders, and how different parts of the brain are impacted by not only ongoing stress, but the stress that ends up becoming traumatic to them. So what do we do about trauma, and how do we actually become trauma-informed educators? One major piece of this is witnessing the fact that our kiddos are experiencing a great number of ACEs in all school districts, in all socioeconomic strata, in all classes of all races, in every single school across this country. And likely on the heels of this pandemic and the way that people have been impacted socially, culturally, economically, and academically, the level of stress that people have experienced this year is much higher, which means that their ACEs are going to potentially double and certainly become more numerous. And their potential for trauma is also going to heighten. So one of our major roles as being trauma-informed educators is to understand that when we are seeing behaviors in the classroom, those kiddos are never just their behaviors. We have to think about the fact that these kiddos are also experiencing ACEs and other stressors, that these ACEs and stressors have potentially become traumatic in that they have become repeated and or toxic, that we may be contributors, and that in order to manage the situation, we have to look at our responses and our ways of thinking and ultimately manage ourselves and our own behavior, in addition to witnessing the kiddo's behavior and how it affects the whole classroom. So being a trauma-informed educator is not just important, but necessary in an equity approach in the classroom and the school. So when we consider how schools, law enforcement, and other pieces of our sociocultural constructs remain inequitable, a big piece of this is understanding that trauma affects behavior. And trauma affects who we're seeing, and trauma can very often be the underpinning to the behaviors that we are seeing and trying to manage. And that if we are attempting to be more equitable in our approach, we have to not only acknowledge that, but also understand that the systems that maintain inequities in our society are actually contributing to those stressors and trauma that the kiddos are experiencing. And very often, our approaches reinforce those. So in order to be equitable educators or people who are equity-oriented, we do have to consider how we participate in perpetuating the disparities, the racism, and the inequities that are present in all of our systems and in our schools. So let's consider this student before we move on to our next topics. This student has been very aggressive in class, lunch, and recess. He's always in movement, and though he's had behavior issues all year that have been a concern, we're seeing it increase to hurting staff and students as well. And it appears from folks who have talked with him that there's also no empathy for others. So now, given everything that we've discussed already, our theories of development, our models of thinking, ACEs, trauma-informed education, our own role in dissecting, understanding, and perpetuating some of these things, and namely some of the inequities, stressors, and traumas that some of these kids are experiencing, think about what could be happening here. What is our first response to this kiddo? What do we want to do to fix the situation or neutralize the situation? And what else could we understand if we're being investigators, detectives, and trauma-informed educators about what this kiddo might be experiencing in their life that has them showing up to school in this way? And what can we do now, knowing what we know, to not only just understand what might be true for this kiddo, but how not to further harm this person? What could be our response such that this person could have a different trajectory in school, either today or long term? So let's look at these questions here. What are the consequences? What would the consequences be in a compliance model? Meaning, if we were to apply behavior undesirable, get to behavioral desirable, what would end up happening to the student in that situation who's showing really aggressive behaviors? If we're thinking about addressing the behaviors from a management model standpoint, how might we respond a little differently? What plan could we make with this person? Can we make a plan with this person? Can we expect them to maintain the plan if we suspect that there are high-level stressors that this child is experiencing? And if we were to be investigators and detectives, what would we ask? What would we need to know? What would we need to understand about this person? And how would we use that information? What would we actually do differently? Or how would we talk to this person differently? Or how would we shift our expectations about whether or not behaviors could become desirable or plans could actually be executed? And how could we position ourselves as trauma-informed educators for this student such that this person could potentially even have a positive experience in our classroom and in our school-based settings? So before we move on to strategies, we'll take a break here.